but I just thought that I would share some of my recent thinking with you on thinking. You know, it's interesting, we're all in this room interested in education. And some of you, I'm guessing, might go into education or think about it. Some of you maybe have been in it. Maybe some of you are still trying to graduate. I think I have never left school. I'm hoping one day I'll graduate and get the heck out. But I'm still on a campus, which is very exciting. But it makes you think about what's the point of it all. Now, I'm in math. I mean, everyone has their favorite discipline. So let's just think math. I'm not going to talk about math. Don't worry about it. But let's just think math. I mean, everyone's had a math experience. Most people in the world had a lousy math experience. And so you think about math, okay? Everyone has to take math from like first grade until they're no longer required to take it, and then they stop. And so what's the point? What's the point of like the quadratic formula? Very important, by the way, and I'm not saying like, I'm not going to cast aspersions on it, but what's the point of learning that when we know that most people in the population will never use the quadratic formula again after they pass their last test? Or let me rephrase that, after they take their last test. They still might not even pass it, but at least they will attempt the last test, and then they'll let it go. Now, the quadratic formula and mathematics in general, of course, drives, as you can imagine, or you might know if you're a mathy person, the society today. I mean, technology, our technological modern world is driven on mathematics and science. It is the foundation for everything. But it's also a fact that you don't have to know how to build a bridge in order to drive over one. And the reality is most people in this world use the things without even having to know about it. So why do we have to teach that minutia? Well, we probably shouldn't, in a way. That's a very provocative thought. But the question that I come back to is, why math? What is the point of teaching math? Especially if they're going to forget all that stuff. So what is the point of whatever it is that you want to teach or that you are currently teaching? And in my opinion, the fundamental point of education is one thing only: to change lives. That's what we are in the business of doing, is to change lives. And we do that through all the wonderful disciplines that human beings have come to explore and discover. And we do that whether it's through the humanities or the social sciences or the natural sciences. But the bottom line is that we're teaching people how to think and how to see the world differently. That is the lesson. And whether you're a teacher of 40 years or whether you're a teacher of 4 days, here's the challenge for you. This is the hardest question you can ever face as an educator. So if you haven't had enough cookies or cake, you might not want to listen. But if you're ready, here it is. I call it the 10-year question. 10 years from today, what lessons will my students remember from my class? And in my case, it's not going to be the quadratic formula. That one's gone. So if I don't offer them anything else, then I've delivered on an empty promise. And so when you're thinking about who you are in the classroom or who you aspire to be, you need to constantly be thinking about not only is there curriculum, obviously, I'm not saying throw away all the content, but how do you infuse into those wonderful human ideas the process, the thinking process that drove people to come up with these ideas. We want to craft original thinkers, people that will be able to go off and after they take our class, be able to think on their own and actually create something that maybe we even ourselves haven't thought of. That would be the ultimate gift. Isn't that the greatest gift you could imagine? Is for a former student to come back to you and tell you something that you didn't know. To me, that is the greatest gift outside of anything expensive that you can buy and give to me. That's the greatest gift you can get as an educator. That's what we want. Okay, so now let's take that as a premise. Let's suppose that some of you buy into that. Yeah, I need to teach my people how to think. Okay, so now how do you do it? So I'm going to offer you just some very, very practical, concrete things that you can think about to actually get your students to think on their own. Okay, so the first one is understanding. And this sounds so ridiculous, but let me say a couple words about understanding. First of all, to realize that understanding is not as young people think of understanding, which is a yes or no proposition. Yep, I understand. No, I don't understand. Of course, if you're really, really young, you never say, I don't understand. You understand everything, right? Ask a 4-year-old, they know everything. I know, right? This is great, right? And as you get older, you realize how ignorant you truly are, and I don't know anything, quite frankly, and I'm proud of that. But to realize that there are levels of understanding. Understanding is a gradation. And this seems daunting at first to a student, but actually it should be very uplifting. Because, see, a student goes, oh, okay, yeah, I understand this. Well, the way they see that subject is very different than how you would see it as a teacher. And so we need to really articulate that to students and tell people that there's a difference. When I write an equation on the board, I actually see something different. I physically see something different than my students. Because I've been thinking about equations for 100 years. They've been thinking about it for maybe 4 years. So I just see things differently. And we have to acknowledge that as teachers, and we have to share that with students. And to say whatever level they're at, they can go higher still. And the uplifting part is that's true for all of us. As long as we're alive, wherever our understanding and knowledge is, it can go higher. It doesn't matter whether you have a PhD and whether you are the expert. You are the person who came up with this whole field of whatever it is, whole field of blah, 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 blah. Whatever it is, you can understand it better. And so that's a way. That's something you can offer your students long after they've forgotten the facts. That wherever my understanding is, I can actually reach even a greater level. That's a mindset. That's a habit that they can think about. Another piece about understanding that I'll share with you is the idea of understanding simple things deeply. If you ask a student a question, and in fact, I think I can almost recognize some of you might even be students, or at least you look fantastically young, which is great. I look that way too when I was not a student. But even when you're in college, if a teacher, a professor asks you a question, you want to impress that person and say, the most, erudite, deep thing, because you want to, have that person love you and so forth. And certainly, younger students have the same tendency. Your challenge as an educator is to force them to look at the simple things as deeply as possible. When I'm talking to someone and they're talking about a math idea, I always ask them the following question. I say, okay, explain this to me as if I were 8 years old. So I don't know calculus. I don't know even how to solve the question. Explain this idea to me as if I were 8. And when a person says, oh, no, it's not possible, then I know that person really doesn't understand it yet. If you really understand something, you should be able to explain the basic atomic structure of the thing. And so always strive to teach students to understand the simple things as deeply as possible. And then paradoxically, as you can probably imagine, once you understand those things, the things that actually seem difficult really aren't. They only appear difficult because we never bother to understand the basic fundamental things really, really well. So there's those two little elements of understanding, the idea of teaching people how to realize understanding. The next thing I want to share with you is my favorite one, which is the power of failing. This is the best thing. If we can teach our students just one thing, I would say teach them how to fail. And in math, it's so easy, right? But that failing that normally happens in math is not the effective failing. I am touting effective failing, not ineffective failing. Ineffective failing is the following. I get a homework back, I see a 62 on it out of 100, and I go, nuts. And I throw it in the back of my notebook, and I move on. That's ineffective failure. Effective failure is I see something that I did not do correctly, and now I say, great. Now I have an opportunity to learn something. Because I can ask a very easy question. Whenever you make a mistake, there's something you can definitely do. You can say, why was that wrong? That's an action item. And by getting in the habit of putting yourself in a position where you can act, you can then move forward. So in fact, not only is failing important, but we have to actually fail by intent. We have to intentionally fail. And you say, well, Ed, that's just the stupidest thing I've ever heard in education. But it happens everywhere else. Think of what a stress test is. You take a beam. So now you're an architect, right? You take a beam of steel, and you keep torquing it and bending it and bending it and bending it until it snaps. You learned something then. It failed, but you learned something. Why not stress tests on the intellectual level? You see? And so, in fact, I think this is so important. This is one of those wonderful moments where I actually put my money where my mouth is, or at least my grades. Because if you take a class with me at Williams College or at Baylor University or wherever I'm teaching, 5% of your final grade in my class is based on the quality of your failure. It makes their heads explode because it's like, wait a minute, so to get an A, I got to fail, but if I fail, I don't get an A, and it's great. Because one of the great joys about being teachers is that you get to mess with their heads. That's just always fun. But the reality is that I want them to realize that I take the charge of failing seriously. And it's not just enough, again, to do poorly on something, but it's to realize that failure is a forward step that brings you to a square, like in a chessboard, and now you can move off of it. That's the power. But that's a mindset that you can teach. And this actually really has impact in the classroom. So I've been teaching now for a long, long time, well over 25 years. And when I was, early on in my teaching career, I looked really, really young. I looked like I was 12 years old. In fact, it was almost like embarrassing. I looked so young. And you would think, okay, well, everyone thought, I was a cool guy and young. I was almost the age of my students, so they kind of related to me. Do you know that since I've instituted the quality of failure, and now I'm an old, broken down, intimidating man, the students are much more engaged and much more open in the classroom than even when I was the young, cool, hip guy that was their age. Because they realize that it's okay. Not only is it okay, but in fact, it's useful. So for example, if Vicki says something and it's wrong, it's not enough to say, oh, it's okay, Vicki, we still love you, we're going to give you a trophy, you're great, No, Vicki's wrong. She's wrong, she's dead wrong. But why is she wrong? Let's talk about it now. Let's figure out why a particular person would say something that was wrong like that. There was some intuition there. So that's something now to do something. And then all of a sudden, Vicki realizes that she didn't set the class back. In fact, she forwarded the discussion. Because it's all about the process. And the reality is that whatever you want to teach and whatever you want to think about, that only came about by constant failed attempts of great minds. And whenever you hear your students, or whenever you, in learning some material from another teacher, utter the thought, how did anyone ever come up with this stuff? Which is a great question you hear a lot, especially in math. The fact that they ask that question means that we've done a wonderful job of covering our intellectual tracks. And we are not teaching it as it actually unfolded in human history. Because if you teach it as it actually unfolded, it was, I tried this, that didn't work, that was bad, okay, so I'm going to try this, that's no good. Oh, wait, I can do this is good, but it only works over here. Oh, but if I go over here, now it's working. And then all of a sudden you see it, and then you build the intuition and the insights, you have the epiphany, the aha moment, and now it makes sense. That path, while it's very surreptitious, the truth is it's natural. We don't have the time to teach that because our curriculum is so fat. So we have to go from here to here. Right. And now it doesn't make any sense. So it's our responsibility to show the importance of getting it wrong as a road, as a way to get it right. And if you value it, it's not enough just to say, oh, good for you. It's important to say, that's great. I mean, when someone makes a mistake in my class, I am so excited. I'm like, oh, Vicki, that is so wonderful. It's totally wrong. But it's great because what an idea. Now, why is that wrong? And then all of a sudden, and then she goes, oh, my quality of failure grade today, very high. And so yeah, it's good, right? But that's it. Okay, so failing is maybe the most potent thing that we can offer. The next thing I wanted to share with you is the art of asking questions. Now, you as current educators, future educators, past educators, all we do is ask questions. That actually, in some sense, brings us to the mastery of the material that we have. But putting it on its side, it's important for our students to have that attitude. We have to teach people in the world that, in fact, an important component in thinking is raising questions. And it's not even as important as you may think to get the answers. It's a mindset, it's a habit of asking questions. And I'll tell you how I do this in my classroom. I actually, I have all the students' names on like index cards, At the beginning of each class, I mix up the cards, and I will select a couple of them, and they will be the official questioners of the day. And their job is to ask at least one question. Now, anyone can ask a question, but there are people that are officially required to ask a question by the end of the class. That's their job. Well, the interesting thing is when you are picked to be the official questioner, all of a sudden now you're going to have a different experience. because now you have to really pay attention. Right? But the reality is you actually have a different inner life experience because now you have to focus in a different way. If you attend, think about like the next lecture that you go to or the next, address that you hear, whatever it is, and just force yourself to say, I am going to create a question. You will have a different experience. And so it's not even the answer that's as significant as the habit of looking at things, because by doing that you will see things. For example, you say, okay, well, now I'm listening to this story or this lecture, but what about this? In fact, Vicki gave a wonderful story herself of how she tried to apply this when she was sitting at a lecture, at a report given by another colleague that was an editorial about a book that this other colleague was putting out in, like, I don't know, it's political science or history or something. And so she sat there and said, okay, I'm going to ask a question. And she actually confessed, and I shouldn't do this because it's not, is it okay to share this? She actually confessed that normally, because she's kind of a mathy kind of gal, look at her. She's kind of a mathy gal. And so when someone's talking about political science or whatever, she tends to kind of not say anything because she doesn't want to look kind of silly. And she goes, I'm going to try this thing about asking questions. And she said, okay, well now this is about some program that's going to help, a certain group of people. What about other people in this community? How are they affected by this thing for these people? And the person responded, oh, that's a great question. But see, the fact that Vicki wanted to ask a question forced her to think about things and make connections that otherwise you might not make if you didn't put yourself in that active listening mode. And that's a way of living life, you see. And that's something that they can take with them long after they forget the facts and the details. And then the final thing I want to share with you is the power of the flow of ideas. When you learn some things like math, but lots of things like history and biology and sociology, you can easily get in the habit of just saying, here's a laundry list of things I just have to memorize. I just got to memorize these things. There's a quiz coming up. I got to get these things down. I got to know these things. Boom, 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 boom. Art history, memorize the date and the artist and know the period, Okay. Well, those are facts. But every single idea or every single physical thing that's been created came from somewhere. And to realize that every idea actually has an origin, and to make it a habit of yours to say, I'm going to actually try to understand that flow of ideas that led a person to that, actually makes it easier to understand the ideas and to remember them and to hold them in your head, because now it's not just a bunch of quantum little bits that don't hang together and you have to memorize all of them. Now it's just one human story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. For example, I'm a mathematician. I have memorized very few formulas. You would be amazed at how few formulas. I know the Pythagorean theorem, which some of you might still remember if it's about right triangles. I know that one. And I know some basic trig stuff. But everything else, I don't remember. However, I can derive because I know the story of math. I can derive everything because I know the story of math pretty well. And so to teach people the flow of ideas, and not only does everything, every idea come from something, but to realize that when you're faced with a new idea, either one that you created or one that someone is sharing with you, that is not the stopping place. So many people today have a new idea. Great, let's celebrate. The reality is that's the time to roll up your sleeves and start to work. Whenever you are armed with a new idea, yours or someone else's, the first thing you think of is, cool, now what? What can I do with this? How can I apply it in a different way? How can I exploit it? How can I whatever with it? And all of a sudden, what are you doing? You're innovating. You're creating new ideas. You're moving forward. And that's what we want to create. Innovative, original thinkers. So here are just 4 simple things to think about, right? Different levels of understanding and what that means. The idea of failing as a way to succeeding. The idea that just the act of creating questions allows you to kind of get more out of everything. And then the basic premise that every idea should lead to some idea, and that every idea actually came from some idea. Now notice that that's not math at all. And yet that is what's required to be a mathematician. And I think that's required to do a lot of things. To analyze a piece of poetry, to appreciate a work of art, to understand a political situation. So there are ways of thinking that you just naturally do because you're drawn to your subject. And your job is to bring that out into the foreground and not the background. education is all about making the invisible visible. Taking things that are there that no one sees and making them prominent. That's what education's about. Because if you can actually bring a student to see something that otherwise they wouldn't see, and then to learn how to do that on their own, then you've genuinely transformed a life. And if they can make it a habit, if they can make it something that they carry with them for the rest of their lives, then you've changed them. You've changed them in a profound way. And that's, of course, the core of education. So let me just close by saying that while we want to think about how to offer the delights and the pleasures and the challenges of the individual disciplines that we want to share with our students, we shouldn't do that at the cost of offering the greatest gift of all, the greatest pleasure, which is the pleasure of independent, original, creative thought. And those habits will stay with them long after they've forgotten the facts. I'll stop there because I've talked way too long. That was way too long. That was very long, by the way. In terms of teaching pedagogy, that was way, way too long.